My whole interest in memorial museums, which I will speak about a lot today, started with my PhD that dealt with one country, Croatia, and one museum, the Jasenovac Memorial Museum at the site of a former concentration camp run not by Nazis but by Ustasha. So then at the end of this PhD project, back way in 2010, I realized that this Jasenovac exhibition, the way it looks from the inside, you can see here, aesthetically looks quite similar to the Holocaust Memorial Center in Budapest in Hungary. You can see both have dark rooms, the names of the victims, which you cannot read, but if I tell you, it should become clear, are written in white letters over the heads of the visitors. And there is quite a focus on the erotic objects or belonging to the victims that are displayed in showcases. Why this was striking, this similarity, is because the two museums are actually quite different. Jasenovac Memorial Museum is at the site of a concentration camp, and thus it's not primarily a site of the Holocaust, but Serbs and Roma have been the biggest victims there, as opposed to the Holocaust Memorial Center in the capital of Hungary, which is not at a particularly relevant in situ site, but is a capital museum in the kind we see rather often, Holocaust Memorial Museum. So after my PhD, or at the end of it, I ended up with this question of why do they look so similar? And that led me to my so-called Habilitation Project. You might know that in Central Europe there is still this dinosaur called habilitation, which is a kind of second doctorate that you need in order to be allowed to have PhD students on your own and so on, and that allows you to apply for professorship. So this was a kind of huge so-called habilitation project dealing with the World War II and post-communist memorial museums. So I compared museums in all current post-communist EU member states, from Estonia in the north down to Croatia in the south, and asked how they changed their exhibitions in the course of EU accession talks, because there was a lot of what I call invocation of Europe going on, trying to communicate with so-called Europe during EU accession talks to prove that one is Europe ready. And then from that, I figured that actually I want to continue this along this path, and it was possible to go on with that by obtaining an ERC Consolidator grant for a project called Globalized Memorial Museums, exhibiting atrocities in the era of claims for moral universals. In this project, we analyzed not only memorial museums devoted to the World War II period, but also those devoted to the 1990s genocides in Bosnia and Rwanda. I will focus especially on this current project today. So the plan for today is to first introduce you briefly to this Globalized Memorial Museums project, then to focus on one trend of these globalized traveling memories and tropes, the focus on exhibiting individual victims. That is one of the major traveling trends that we observed so far. Not on heroes, the focus not on heroes, not on martyrs, not on celebrities in the resistance, but on the individual victims. And then I will, in the third part, come to a case study in which I introduce you to the new Bosnian memorial museums dedicated to the 1990s war, because there has been a huge wave of openings of such museums within the last 5 years or so. So this is what I'm aiming to do today. Okay, so let's come to the project. This current project was inspired by the fact that I saw a lot of blurring when it came to terminology, speaking of globalization or universalization of Holocaust memory. There was a fuzzy terminology conflating moral and spatial issues. I don't see still up until today a clear concept of either of the two. So the Holocaust has been considered a historical reference point, legitimizing a global moral imperative to respect human rights, but this is all a bit known on the one hand, but blurred and vague on the other hand. So my initial question was, what is the price of this decontextualization, of this idea that the Holocaust plays a role in museums all over the world, even in China, where the architect of the Nanjing Museum explicitly references the Holocaust as his inspiration, and so on and so forth. So we started off, even in initial proposal phase, by arguing that what is called globalization of memory is in fact several parallel, partially contrary trends. I will speak about those trends now. I just want to say, before I do that, that please be aware that because of the pandemic, I will not be able to show you so many examples from those countries that we focus on, like China, Japan, Rwanda, because in contrast to my team members who have the citizenship of the respective country and were in most cases allowed to go there for research, I wasn't allowed. So therefore, I will a bit reproduce, unfortunately, again, this Western and Europe-centered focus in my examples, simply because the pandemic didn't allow me to go, and I am definitely no one who wants to speak about something that I haven't visited myself. I think that would be not serious work, and I also do not want to use the research of my team members that has not been published yet in this regard. Therefore, please bear with me for this a bit drawing from the museums I have already visited before the pandemic broke. Okay, so I will speak about 3 of the trends briefly before I focus on one of them. One trend is that USHMM, so the US Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., and the Israeli Holocaust Museum Yad Vashem are addressed as role models, explicitly or implicitly, by other museums dedicated to atrocities in World War II, but also way beyond that. We see here that they serve as a role model for a universal moral orientation, a focus on the individual victim, which I will deal with later, and some kind of, let's call them very broadly, aesthetic standards for musealization. We see reappearing aesthetic quotes, so to say, of those 2 installations that we see here. On the one hand, the Tower of Faces from the US Holocaust Memorial Museum that contains photographs, private photographs before the persecution, taken by a village photographer who, in a Jewish village that then got annihilated by the Nazis in 1941. And the granddaughter of the photographer collected these grandfathers and his assistants and his wife's photographs of this village that doesn't exist anymore, and donated that to the USHMM. On the other hand, we see the Yad Vashem example of the so-called Hall of Names, where on top in this room you see all those privately taken photographs. When I say private photographs, I always mean as opposed to taken by perpetrators in a humiliating way or similar things. So private photographs, and below them are like cases with biographical information of each of the victims. Another trend that I want to touch upon briefly is what in German scholars have called so-called negative memory, so self-critically confronting the crimes committed by its own community, not suffered by our own community, but committed by our own community. Example for that, this has inspired museums in many countries to tackle complicity, collective self-victimization, and externalization of responsibility. In many cases, we cannot find any trace of this trend as well. So this is a clear watershed some kind. The example I want to show you comes from the surprisingly currently authoritarian and historically revisionist Hungary, from the already mentioned Holocaust Memorial Center in Budapest. This was that opened its exhibition in 2006, but the museum in 2004, weeks before Hungary joined the EU. And here we see a rare example of this negative memory. We see photographs, so visual documentation of population as perpetrators, and even, as you can see on the last picture, women as perpetrators. Usually you would have this perpetrator side represented through some officials, authorities, governments, gendarmes, policemen, or so on. But clearly there are some hints that this trend is traveling as well. Always when I'm introducing those trends, it's never like, it's always while I'm very aware of the power relations that go hand in hand with that, the hegemony. Of course, as you can see when I said that it's all about, for example, EU accession attempts of the countries, this is not a development that is free of power relations, on the contrary. Okay, so these 2 trends can be found in many, many museums beyond World War II museums. Here is an example from the Kigali Genocide Memorial in Rwanda, which my PhD student researches on. You can recognize the already familiar element here. It's a high wall installation with private photographs of the victims, contributing to an empathy-evoking way of remembering those victims, rather than representing them as it might have been done earlier as anonymous masses gathered together, but we don't know who are the people. In Rwanda, there is yet another trend very present, which you might have heard of, and that is the exhibiting of human remains that we can find in basically all the major memorial sites and museums. And this leads me to the third trend we are interested in, because in Rwanda we also have this inclusion of the sites of the genocide into the memorial space, and a strong focus on the materialities of genocide, which has been discussed under the topic of under the term forensic turn, the investigation of bones and other material evidence of atrocities that connects with the cultural studies, with the cultural dimension, with the memory dimension. So both go hand in hand. And now here we are asking in how far this forensic turn that is strongly connected to the genocides in Rwanda and Bosnia has had an impact also on the treatment of the so-called old World War II memorial sites. If the extermination camp sites like Sobibor were, after many, many decades of nothing forensically or a little forensically happening, the gas chamber, for example, was discovered, or the remains of the gas chamber were discovered in 2014. This third part is a very big open question for us. So this is really like, I'm not presenting yet any finished results on that. So what we are trying to do is to conduct a first global typology that does not, as so many have done before, focus primarily on Europe, the US, and maybe Israel, and then maybe have one or two exotic cases from somewhere else. No, what we want to do is to look at 50 museums and memorial sites worldwide and to ask, on the one hand, obviously, how the old role model Holocaust museums have influenced the other ones. But then the other World War II museums or Holocaust museums, but then also how this World War II and Holocaust musealization influenced the museums in Bosnia and Rwanda. And I hope that this will be the most innovative and promising part of our project. We also ask in how far the musealization and memorialization in Rwanda and Bosnia has had an impact on the old sites from World War II. So let's turn back to the first trend and to this focus on the individual victims. We can see many examples of that. Here is one from the Women's Action Museum in Tokyo, dedicated to the so-called comfort women, so to the sex slaves of the Japanese. Here we see an installation, and I could show you numerous pictures like that allude to those aesthetic role models and show private photographs of the persecuted, how they depicted themselves and not how the perpetrators depicted them. Of course, when I speak about exhibiting individual victims or proponents in the exhibitions, there is quite a broad range of what that can mean. So let me show you what I have in mind. The very basic approach would be to have those privately taken photographs, like in this left-hand example from the Museum of World War II in Gdansk. But that's it. Like, the photos are not linked to names, not linked to biographies or anything. And then there is, of course, in this regard, also the danger that they already start like being symbols and lose their individualizing power. On the other hand, the very basic approach to that can be to include those names. I don't know if you have seen that often. To me, it seems that these white names written on black background are all over the museums I visit and are a very strong and currently very often used mean of addressing individual victims on a very basic first level. On the other side of this spectrum are combinations of several elements, of several media that can be used to tell someone's story. That's a story of a persecuted. For example, the use of biographical objects, things that have been preserved and can be attributed to a person or a family, and combined with private photographs, combined with a brief biography of the person, that are not exhibited because they are typically Jewish, like the everywhere present anonymous Star of David, that is a typical symbol then of the Jewish victims, but is not attributed to anyone. Here the story is told at the Auschwitz exhibition in New York City at the Jewish Heritage Museum. Or another element can be that a private photograph is combined with a poem written by a persecuted person during imprisonment or after, if the person survived. So this, I just am explaining to say that I'm perfectly aware that there is a very broad range of what this approach can mean. Why is it so often used as a curatorial strategy? Well, I would argue because it is a very powerful tool that allows the curators to evoke empathy with the persecuted through the story of one individual or several or many individual stories that can be also then added in the guided tours, and from my experience play a very strong, very important role in those guided tours at the museums. Now, the problem, so to say, with this is that copying these aesthetics and using this musealization technique can be used for basically almost any nationalist, and even historical revisionist purpose. So what I'm arguing is that the mere similarity or referencing something as a role model does not necessarily mean that the same message is conveyed with that, the same narrative is given by that mean. Let me explain what I mean. Here's an example of the House of Terror in Budapest. This is a museum that is located at a building in which first Nazi collaborators had tortured prisoners, and then after 1945, socialist state security tortured prisoners. So it is one of those Eastern European buildings that has this double history of first being used in the Nazi era by Hungarian collaborators and then by the state socialists. Now this installation from Hungary, again, is multi-story, just like in the Washington example. It is over all the 3 floors of the museum, and thus the House of Terror also explicitly references the US HMM as a role model. But when we look closer, you might even from this photo recognize that the photos are different. They are not privately taken photographs of how the victims chose to depict themselves. They are actually mugshots taken by state security perpetrators of the persons that they imprisoned. And also, as we can see from the Soviet tank that is based at the bottom of this multi-story installation, all those victims here are victims of persecution by the socialist and Soviet post-45 authorities. So although the house has a double history and also the Hungarian Nazi collaborators tortured there, these victims are excluded from this installation. So basically, this is titled, so the caption on top of this installation is victims. And actually all of those individual victims here merge also through the use of these uniform mugshots into one collage of collective victimhood of Hungary. So actually, although there is an explicit reference to Washington, the message is one of collective victimhood, and this museum is a Viktor Orban Fidesz historical revisionist nationalist museum that writes its own version of history according to the current authoritarian backlash. So it was opened already in 2002 by Viktor Orban during his election campaign as the first hint of how his authoritarian historical revisionist version of Hungarian past looks like. Another example is from the earlier called Museum of Genocide Victims in Vilnius in Lithuania, today renamed into Museum of Occupation and Freedom Fights. Again, a building that has this double history, first from the first Soviet occupation in the Baltic case, then the Nazi occupation, then the second Soviet occupation. But the museum actually, for many years of its existence, has simply omitted the Nazi period from 1941 to 44 and jumped directly from the end of the first Soviet occupation in Lithuania in 41 to the beginning of the second Soviet occupation in 44. So it just omitted the phase of the Nazi occupation. biographical objects are exhibited under this glass floor, very similar to Holocaust museums, how they do it. But again, those are only victims of Soviet persecution. And the Holocaust has been missing in this museum. The only thing you can find is a board around at the size of where your ankle on your leg is, saying in between the room on the first Soviet occupation and the room on the second Soviet occupation, to visitors willing to get acquainted with the period of Nazi occupation in Lithuania and Holocaust more extensively, we suggest visiting the Vilna Gaon Jewish State Museum. So this is how the Holocaust victims have been represented until this room has been added as an exhibition space in 2011, where we have even scratchings from the people imprisoned there, from Helena from 1943, who left her scratched name in this wall of this cell. So despite those traces, those individual names left there by the prisoners, this part of the history has been excluded here. Also, when we look at the visual representations of victims, we can observe that there is quite a difference in how different groups are exhibited in this museum. The victims of Soviet occupation are exhibited in the way I have explained before, and we could expect now already, through private photographs, which are in a very meaningful way contrasted with the mugshots taken by perpetrators to show what has been done to this person, confronted or accompanied by biographies, so and biographical objects. So in a very empathy-evoking way, I would say that works very well with the visitors. In the new room on the Holocaust and the Nazi occupation, in contrast to that, we have pictures like the two I'm showing you here, where we see anonymous groups of people herded into cattle wagons. We don't get this individual part. And this is remarkable because the upper photo, we know so much about it, and the museum chose not to give this information. We know that this photo on the right-hand side, the upper one, here reading Jews driven out of their homes, 1941, was taken by a famous Warsaw-based Jewish photojournalist, Henry Cross, who was himself imprisoned in the Polish ghetto of Łódź, and there he took this photo. And this is part of his famous exhibitions, and so we know so much about it. But this whole story that could be used as a strong empathy-evoking way of telling his story of this photojournalist, this opportunity is missed, and this is not a coincidence or a mistake. I argue that this is done because the Holocaust memory is experienced as threatening to our own majority, in this case Lithuanian population, because many more people have been killed by the Nazis, many more Jews have been killed by the Nazis than ever there had been victims of Soviet persecution, dead through Soviet crimes. So there is a competition, and these individualizing means of exhibiting the victims are obviously perceived as something that should be used for exhibiting our own suffering exclusively. And the year is wrong, by the way. Henry Cross took the photo in 42, not in 41. Another case in point is the Museum of Occupation of Latvia in Riga, so in the central of the three Baltic states, where again our individual victims are represented through biographical objects that the inmates produced, like drawings, dolls, or but there is a huge difference to, again, how their anonymous victims are presented. So in the Holocaust section, which is actually quite extensive in this museum, the visual level representations are very few and very problematic. We have a perpetrator taken photo of two Jews who are not allowed to walk on the pavement because the law forbids that for Jews, so they have to walk on the street. We have the always present anonymous Star of David as a symbol for Jewish measures against Jews. We have an anti-Semitic poster here, so one that depicts Jews in a stereotypical way. And the final exhibit I will show only briefly because I think it's the most problematic one. This is displayed in over 2 meter size so that everyone runs into it, you cannot escape it. And it shows women, Jewish women, in their underwear only seconds before their execution. which has been described by those who survived such things as a specific form of humiliation, this perpetrator's gaze that they were subjected to. And this is not discussed in the exhibition. It's just said that the photo is just there and nothing is problematized about it. So this is one of the Liepaja execution photos. Another trend of individualization, but not of the victims, is the trend to exhibit individual rescuers of Jews, not the rescued themselves. Here's again the example from the very same Museum of Occupation of Latvia in Riga, where we don't have private photographs, as I just explained, of Jews who were persecuted, but we have many photographs of Latvians who rescued Jews. They are given by name, and then it says how many Jews they rescued. This is a very striking difference, because obviously since they rescued them, those names are known, but they are chosen not to be exhibited here. We have similar trends. This is quite a trendy development we see in several countries. This focus on the rescuers of Jews is a kind of response to this universalization of the Holocaust as a negative icon of our era. One way to respond to that I see a lot is to put the focus on the Jewish rescuers, on the rescuers of Jews. We have had this trend before, but now it's very prominent, especially in the authoritarian backlash regimes of Hungary and Poland. Here is an example from the much disputed Museum of World War II in Gdansk, that is being challenged by the Polish Law and Justice Party and being redesigned, remodeled by force by the current government, because it was too international, too much focused on Polish shame instead of Polish patriotism and so on. And in the middle of the Holocaust section here, done by, among others, a very dear colleague of mine, they have now added a huge photo of the Ulma family of Poles who saved Jews. There is even a whole museum in the countryside in the town of Markowa devoted to this Ulma family. And this means actually that there is a de-Holocaustization of the whole Holocaust exhibit by shifting the focus. Of course, it's important to state that some people saved Jews, but the impression here is that this was a regular thing, whereas actually those who did save Jews, especially in Poland, were severely punished by their neighbors who denounced them, who called that in and often killed. So this is actually a minority phenomenon that was very unpopular, to say the least, with the other Polish neighbors around oneself. Another thing, and my last example on this, how the approach to individual victims can be used for national purposes, is that the focus on the individual victims draws attention away from the self-critical confrontation with perpetrators from one's own community. So the example for that can be found at the Jasenovac Memorial Museum, the already mentioned former Ustaša concentration camp in Croatia, where we have every mentioned element. We have the names of the victims, we have the drawings of, in this case, a child prisoner, we have the video testimonies of survivors, and many other aspects at this museum. But since the focus is so much on the victims, what we don't have is a lot of discussion about the perpetrators. So there are only 2 of the permanently installed photos in the museum that deal with the Croatian perpetrators in this war, because what is important to know in this context is that the Croat so-called independent state of Croatia that existed from 1941 to 1945 was a rare example of one regime running death camps on its own, as opposed to delivering the Jews to the Nazis, as most of the others did. We only have this example in Croatia, in the Jasenovac camp and other concentration camps run by the Croatian Ustaša, and with the Romanians in Transnistria, but this was not main territory, this was occupied territory, so to say, so it's slightly different. But this specific issue of why was it that the Croats were running their own death camps can be avoided. I mean, it is said in the museums that the Ustascher were the perpetrators. The organization of the camp is not blamed on the Nazis, but this specific context of Croats playing a different role than other collaborating countries is not touched upon. And I would argue that the focus on the individual victims allows to avoid such questions. Okay, I will now come briefly to my third part to show you on one country that I stick to so that you can easily, hopefully, follow what I'm explaining, how this plays itself out in one country that has experienced war and even a genocide quite lately, so in the 90s. Here we can see several rather recent, rather new museums devoted to this Bosnia war after the breakup of Yugoslavia. And they are all completely different. I think that's really fascinating. They differ significantly in almost any regard. So I would give you three very different examples to explain what everything that I have said so far, how that can end up showing up in the museums. The first one is a privately run Museum of Crimes Against Humanity and Genocide located in Sarajevo and opened in 2016. Here, basically, the first exhibit you see is this one, where the persecution of the Bosnians in the war of the 90s is equalized with or parallelized with a boy from the Jewish ghetto who was selling armbands with the Star of David. The caption says, Predor municipality. This was the first time since 1939 Nazi decree for Polish Jews to wear white armbands with the blue Star of David, that members of an ethnic or religious group were to be marked for their ethnicity in this way. Pardon? Was someone saying something?
Someone don't remute the microphone, so please ignore. Please go on.
Okay, sure. So in this case, the message is that we Bosniaks or Bosnian Muslims are the new Jews, which as a consequence implies that the Serbs, as the perpetrators, are depicted here as the new Nazis or fascists. This is, of course, when you think that's true, how can living together in a shared state like Bosnia and Herzegovina still is work if this is the terminology we are thinking about? So us as the new Jews and them as the new Nazis and fascists, which of course completely ignores that Serbs were, of course, the main perpetrators, but not the only ones who had committed crimes, and so on and so forth. Another example is the one from, my PowerPoint is stuck here, from the War Childhood Museum in Sarajevo. If you ever go to Sarajevo, I can highly recommend this museum. It is devoted to children's experience during the siege of Sarajevo in the 1990s, where for several years Sarajevo was blocked by Serb troops who were shooting down on it from the surrounding hills around the town of Sarajevo. In this museum, we have a focus on one individual object from a child in this war, in this siege, and a piece of testimony from this very child or teenager, different ages. I think this worked very touching, and even for me, who was born in Zagreb, I recognized some of the stuff that as something from my childhood that might not be immediately recognizable for people from further abroad coming to this museum. But to me, this worked very well as a very powerful and empathy-evoking way of approaching this war, because so many different experiences were addressed here. Also of, for example, when there was basically no proper food supply, and international forces were dropping off powder that could be produced, that could be used for food. And then one child says that they were trying to make ice out of milk powder and how they produced that, but then there was this additional problem that there was basically never electricity during the siege. And through those mini stories, I think a very powerful picture of the war can be drawn. The only reference here to international tropes can be found in the translation of one letter. Here we are talking about the birthday letter that one father sent to his daughter from a camp. Now, in the original, in Bosnian language, we see the word logor, which simply means camp. Whereas for the international visitors, this has been translated as a concentration camp. In order to be internationally recognizable, to again feed this idea of Bosnian Muslims, or so-called Bosniaks, being the new Jews of today, and to make it internationally kind of readable. But it is a significant change that I couldn't observe in any of the other translations that such an addition was made. So I thought that was interesting, but basically this is the only trace in this museum of trying to portray the Bosniaks as the new Jews. Another case, the most famous in Bosnia, is the case of the Stravanitsapotocherry Memorial. Here we have several phases of development of this memorial site. The first site to be developed was the graveyard, where all the identified victims are buried up until today in an annual ceremony each year. Each of the newly identified remains are buried there. This is the oldest phase. Then from 2007, we have a memorial room in the former battery factory that the UN used in their bases in this enclave of Srebrenica in 1995, and where many Bosnian Muslims, or so-called Bosniaks, from this enclave hid or hoped to find shelter in the UN base. And in this memorial room, and also in one of the galleries in Sarajevo, we can find this famous photograph taken by the photographer Tarek Samarah of a so-called mother of Srebrenica. Here it says mother from Srebrenica, like self-organized group that sought justice for their disappeared and not yet found and not yet identified sons, victims of the genocide. And this photo shows one of these mothers of Srebrenica looking at the photo of Anne Frank and her sister. And the years on top suggest again that there is a continuity, and that what happened in 95 happened to us, the new Jews, the new persecuted victims. In contrast to that, the newest addition to this memorial site is the permanent exhibition on Srebrenica genocide, the failure of the international community. This is located in this building where the UN troops had their rooms. So graffitis were kept of the UN troops, but also of the Serbs who had their headquarters there later. Even if those graffitis are sexistic or problematic, racist or something, these graffitis are involved into the exhibition. I think this is very interesting. So if you can go there, I can recommend highly to visit that. And in this permanent exhibition, we see again a completely different approach. And I would call this actually a best practice example, because what is taken from Holocaust museums is not the claim that we are the new Jews and they are simply the new Nazis, and we are as innocent as the new Jews and they are as evil as the Nazis were. But what is taken are those musealization techniques here in this Srebrenica example. So one technique is this picking individual victims, exhibiting their story, their private photographs, their biographies, from room to room, accompanying the visitors. And this is even introduced as one of the carrying three planes or elements of the exhibition. It says one of the approaches the curator chose is this personal storyline. The third and last storyline is personal. Here you follow the fate of one of the genocide, of a victim of the genocide, Riyad Fejzić or Riki. You learn about the life and death of an ordinary teenage boy in Srebrenica and about his mother's struggle to find his mortal remains. So, and another case in point for this is that the exhibition that was also co-designed together with Westerbork Memorial, so in cooperation with Westerbork Memorial in the Netherlands, we have here a focus on dealing with the void, on not making sense of martyrdom, not claiming that the victims died for a reason, but they died in a senseless act of mass murder. And I would say that this is also something that we can take as a good way or a best practice way from Holocaust museums, from World War II museums, and this is applied here when the topic of the void is broached, when it says that for thousands of survivors, both women and men, it feels as if the events of July 95 took place only yesterday. They have to live without so many family members, deprived of normal living conditions, and so on, haunted by nightmares and so on. So there is nothing like heroic, like, yeah, we were martyrs who died for a purpose. So this void is something that has been copied from the museums devoted to the World War II period, I would argue. Okay, let me come to a conclusion. In how far can thus Holocaust museums be seen as role models? In how far do they feature explicitly or implicitly? If I downsize the many questions we have in our project for the purpose of today to this one question and try to give a simple answerable answer, we can say that in aesthetics and musealization strategies, we see many references, explicit and implicit, to Holocaust museums, explicit references from architects about how to design the museum buildings, in musealization strategies when it comes to those dark rooms with the white names of the victims written in white letters against the dark background, or suitcases as a symbol, and so on. We see many elements here. And what we see as the most strongest trend at the moment is that these individual testimonies, private photographs, biographical objects of ordinary people are used as a strong museological tool. And this has often replaced anonymous heaps of bodies or anonymous masses of people in those museums that have changed their exhibition strategies for all victim groups. But what we also see is that sometimes the two different approaches, individual versus anonymous heap of human remains, are used for different victim groups at the same museum to evoke empathy more with the one group, whereas the memory of the other is perceived as threatening. And therefore, I argue that these templates that are referenced in many museums worldwide can be understood actually as a download that is used in almost every thinkable way for local and national memory politics needs. I thought it would be more narrow the variants how referencing explicitly international role models will be used for the national purposes. It was clear that the translation to the national context or the local context will always take place, and that how it ends up in the respective museum in Rwanda will be much different than how it was, which function one certain musealization technique had in the museum where that is referenced as a role model. But the variety of how any purpose can be attributed to these aesthetically similar strategies of musealization was still somehow surprising to me. Okay, I will leave it there, and I'm looking forward to your questions and comments. Thank you so much. Oh, by the way, one more. For those of you who read German, my habilitation book on the World War II and post-communist memorial museums has been just published and is available open access for everyone to download if you're interested, but it is unfortunately in German, so only for a limited audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this fascinating talk. And the floor is now open for questions. If you want to ask something, please do feel free to use the hand function. And yeah, brilliant. And Elena, thank you so much for kicking us off.
Hi, may I go first? So my name is Elena Fosa from Loughborough University. Thank you very much, Ljiljana. It was really fascinating, really rich, and I have multiple questions, but I think I'll just focus on two for now. And the first one is really just a continuation, asking a bit more about what you just said, that these memory templates can be appropriated in the context of different memory politics. You had in the beginning of your presentation, one of the characteristics of globalized memory would be a negative memory as a trend. And I just want you to comment a bit more about whether this trend is actually there, or whether this trend is a trend of the past. I know, like in memory studies, there have been a lot of publications around the politics of regret and negative memory, and we are now in a very different political moment with populism, nationalism. I think a lot of the examples that you presented fit into this, the focus on our victims. So is this a backlash, or was there ever really a broad trend of a negative memory? Is something I would be interested in on the basis of your findings so far. And the other question is in relation to perpetrators. So you spoke quite a bit about the victims and representation strategies for victims. How much do perpetrators actually figure in museums, and maybe also in relation to scholarship and memory studies? There have been questions about this binary between victims and perpetrator, and Rothberg has published a book recently about implicated subjects and complicity. So I was wondering whether questions like this also figure in these museums. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So regarding negative memory, well, it depends if there is a purpose, if there is a goal to be gained by including this self-critical remembrance of the crimes committed by one's own community. So like in the context of the EU accession talks, where one group of the museums, which I call the group that has been doing this invocation of Europe, proving their Europe readiness, it was a very broad trend. And even in, for example, in Hungary, we have this example that I showed you, and this museum is still there, untouched, although the regime wants to do something completely else and to tell us a completely different story at the moment under Orban. So if there is if the negative memory inclusion in the museum serves some kind of domestic or international purpose, then we can find it. Also in cases like Japan, where until 2009, for example, at the Osaka Peace Museum, Japan was regarded rather critically, but then forced by the next government to take that out from the exhibition and to completely erase this dealing with Japanese aggression from their exhibitions. So we cannot say that it is a past trend altogether. I wouldn't go there. I would say that it depends which is the dominant reason for how to design which exhibition at which point. It can be internationally motivated or domestically. And then does it fit or does it not fit? But clearly there has been, and there you're absolutely right, if I got you right, that was what you were suggesting. Clearly there is no sweeping dominance of traveling negative memory in the museums. On the contrary, you're right about that. But we do find traces that are then the more interesting because they are there in countries where we wouldn't accept them. Or also then it depends on within a country we can have tension between the center and the periphery, where the periphery, like in the, let's take to the Japan case, Okinawa can find it easier to talk about Japanese aggression because they would perceive themselves as victims of that. So it's not actually negative memory, but it's a Japanese museum that deals with it. And there we then have also these differences between the center and the periphery within a country where, negative memory can play a role again. Regarding perpetrators in museums and in how far this mirrors the debate in the scholarly literature, I would say this is something that we can, like, mirroring the debate on, well, we have much more than perpetrators, victims, and bystanders and witnesses. Maybe we are way beyond that on the scholarly level. This is reflected in some of the museums, of course, especially we can find that in the German-speaking countries where it is very trendy to speak about all the different shades of from perpetratorship to being an implicated subject to being then later maybe even persecuted, whatever. For example, the Mauthausen Memorial in Austria has changed where it starts, the guided tour. It now starts outside at the soccer field to say that the camp guards played soccer with the population around the camp, and there were a lot of intermarriages. So the whole focus has shifted here, and there are those rare cases where complex roles are depicted at the museum exhibitions as well. In the most cases I have looked at, this is very simple, and there is not so much thinking about how can we go beyond the victim / perpetrator / maybe bystander category. So this is rather reduced. And then, of course, when it comes to perpetrators, the crucial question is, do they at all include our own perpetrators, or would they just externalize guilt on the big powers like Hitler, Stalin, or whoever, depending on the context? I hope that answers your questions a bit.
Brilliant. Thank you, Elena, for your questions, and thank you, Lily. Do we have any further questions for our speaker at this minute?
Thank you, Ljiljana. Sabina Micha here. Again, thank you so much for this presentation. Such a fascinating project. I mean, I guess two questions. One is a very general one. Where do you go from here? You know, what's you know, what are you thinking in terms of the next step, and what I guess would you have done things differently, you know, if you were starting the project now? Because you know, we've had the pandemic, okay, the rise of, you know, populist governments in, you know, some parts of the globe have started already at the time when you were designing the project, I guess. But you know, were you prepared? Are you able within this framework to capture these changes, or is there something new out there that you know, isn't quite captured yet? So that's one. And the other, if you just could give us a flavor, maybe. I understand that, you know, a flavor of what's happening in some of the other countries that you're covering, and I understand obviously that you don't want to share the work of your research team members who haven't published yet, but I'm just curious, you know, is it mostly, you know, following these patterns that you presented to us today, or is it something completely different, say in China in particular? No, because the memory politics should be very different. And I'm partly asking because we have a few of our Chinese students in the audience as well, and one of mine is working on a project on memory in China at the minute, so I'm sure she'd be interested in hearing something about that. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. So regarding the question if we were able to also incorporate kind of the changes, and if we would do something differently if the project would start now, well, actually, it works surprisingly well to capture the diachronic dimension. Although we have so many museums that we look at, this comes through me bringing in the material from my previous parts, and our advisory board members, whom I haven't mentioned yet, bringing in their research from even decades ago. So for example, let's stick to the Chinese case. We have Kirk Denton as our advisory board member, who is also the second PhD supervisor of my PhD students who focus on China, Marketa Bajgerova, and who has done already her MA on memorial museums in China before China kicked her out of the country. And so through Kirk's photos, we can then access all these diachron changes as well, surprisingly well. And also, there are several other instances where we were so lucky to get materials from before, and also to capture these political shifts like new government, new authoritarian backlash, and so on. So for whole of Europe, I would say it's well documented by myself, because even before I started doing museums, I had working on museums. I did this in my spare time, so we have a lot of documentation here. Regarding the pandemic, I don't know if you meant also if it seems manageable to do that now, this project. Well, actually, yeah, it has worked quite well because we were lucky in a way. So as I said, the citizenship allowed many team members to go, for example, to Japan. He had to quarantine then, but still it worked somehow. And so we never ran out of materials. That was my worry, also especially for the PhD students, because they have only limited time. I think since we are obsessed by the authoritarian backlashes we are seeing, I think we will be able to capture that, because so much of our energy goes into criticizing these developments. So I hope that we will be able to achieve that, because this is really one of my main motivators, negative motivators. So yeah, I hope that this will be the case. Okay, regarding results on China, well, in China we have basically examples for everything that I can think of. We have those explicit references to the Holocaust by the Nanjing architect, for example. We have sweeping changes all the time in how the museums look, how the permanent exhibitions look, and what the policy is. So actually Marketa's approach would be to say that there is already a new shift in Chinese memory politics, from this era of humiliation to the new proudness, to not speaking about the humiliation as the main point, but as something that we have overcome. And she sees that also in the huge addition to the Nanjing Museum. And she has also worked a lot on the gender aspects, on the gender representations in the museum, and sees significant changes there, basically also through the addition of those two museums on the so-called comfort women, which the Chinese government is kind of uncomfortable with, but as an international signal for the UNESCO application, it added those museums but keeps them unapproachable. That was one of the most interesting Marketa's findings. For a Chinese museum, rather untypically, you need to go to a security check and at the Nanjing Comfort Museum, and the access is limited to 200 people per day, and the other one is based at the university campus in a room that is not a museum on its own, so access is kind of limited. And Marketa, if I may say that in advance, interprets that. Her article will be published soon, so that should be fine. She interprets that as a fear that these museums and those exhibitions will mobilize feminist activism and discussion about sexual violence in contemporary China, and that therefore there is this ambivalence in, on the one hand, we add the comfort women as an international signal, but on the other hand, we are a bit uncomfortable with it. So, yeah.
Okay, we have a question from Jin Dai. She said, I just noticed you marked some places of memorial museums located in China and Japan on the map, such as Nanjing, at that time the capital of China during the Sino-Japanese War. You mentioned them, but no other details. Based on your fieldwork or feedback from students in the project, how do museums in Asian countries differ from the European countries in remembering the World War II? What are the differences of museums in Asian countries memorializing the World War II, and how does this fit in or differ to the so-called international standards of memorialization? Yeah, that's all.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting. Again, the Asian museums, this doesn't exist, because we see huge differences, of course, between Chinese and Japanese museums already, and then museums within Japan, as I hinted at. So this is different, but we see many differences, of course. Maybe I can say something about our methodology. We have, for example, a shared set of questions that we ask every museum, like not the museum officials, but we ask ourselves to answer when we go to the museums, in order to keep that comparable. And we are, of course, changing this list all the times, because new aspects come in. And then we noticed that starting from the European and Western-centered categories, we were way too victim-focused and perpetrator-focused and collaborator-focused. And when you go with that to, for example, the Yasukuni Shrine and the Yushukan Museum in Tokyo, which is devoted to the fallen Japanese fighters, you don't have neither victims nor perpetrators there. So we had to adjust our categories and then speak of only proponents more neutrally, and then fill this proponent or actor category with what each museum offers us. And so that we stay more open, because there you have these friendly people who fought for their country, and they are neither victims nor perpetrators nor something in between. They are just friendly people who fought in the war, even if they were then convicted war criminals. They are all enshrined, their spirits are all enshrined there. So we had to adjust as we walk and question, of course, at all times our categories. But yeah, even let's stick to the Nanjing massacre example. Even there, okay, Japanese museums would call that the Nanjing incident, Whereas there is a huge and growing museum at Nanjing that tells a completely different story. So again, the Asian memorialization of World War II cannot be, that's not the right way to think about it. But yeah, many examples or many approaches and terminology differ from what we see in Europe and the West. Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing your insights. It's really fascinating. Thank you for everybody for joining us, and I think this brings us to more than 2 o'clock. Thank you for everyone, and thank you so much for Lily. Okay, thank you so much, and happy Friday. Have a good weekend. Thank you everybody, and many thanks again to you, Lily.
Thank you. Stay safe. Bye.